So this is edition 5 of my advanced material pack for Unreal Engine 4. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the instances that are available in this pack, and then show you obviously some of the parameters and stuff that you can adjust for each instance. So there are 17 material instances. Multiple of these instances are based on a single master material, so there are going to be less master materials than there are instances, obviously. And I'll show you, like I said, a quick overview of the parameters and stuff available in each of these instances. So I'm actually going to start on the other end of this showcase here. So all the materials are laid out in the showcase map that you have here. Now, the marketplace, due to their guidelines, they wouldn't allow me to release this as a standalone project. The reason I wanted to do that is because there are some project settings that you want to change to enable some of the features of these material instances. So before we actually go into the material instance settings, I want to show you the features that you should enable to get the most out of these materials. So if you go into Edit, Project Settings, the first thing that you want to go and enable is distance fields. So if you type distance field at the top, the very first thing that comes up is generate mesh distance fields. You want to make sure that you check this box. Once you do that, it's going to ask you to restart, but don't restart just yet. The next thing you want to enable is Clear Coat Enable Second Normal. This is going to be used for the Parallax Occlusion Map Clear Coat material that I have set up. And then once you're done with that, you can go in and restart the editor, and all of the materials should work as intended. All right, so let's start with the materials on the other end of this showcase. So I'm going to start on this side over here. So the first material we have here is skin. So this is an advanced skin material that utilizes subsurface profile. So it does look a little overly glossy in this example. That's because the glossiness I actually have set up for the showcase map, not for preview and all that stuff. So if I go to 2.5 for the roughness, it should look a little bit more natural. Okay. So this does use a subsurface profile. Right now the mask that I'm using to control the density and all that stuff, you can see the split right here. That's based on this mask. So if I hide it and show it, basically what this mask does is it'll separate the pieces. You'll have like lip, ear, thick, thin, which you can see here. Sorry, thick, thin, thick, eyelids, and lips is how I have it set up currently. Now, lips and earlobes, you could use the same one. They're going to have similar transmission values. And basically what you do is your mask will be separated into red, green, and blue values, and each one of those is assigned to a specific area. So thick and thin are going to be the standard, and then eyelids and lips will be separated by colors as well. And then you also have obviously your albedo color, your overall normal, and then your RMAH, which is your roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, and height. And I have some tutorials on my YouTube channel on how to do channel packing. And then the masks, as I mentioned before, will separate your thin, thick, eyelids, and lips. So you can basically go into Substance Painter, for example, and go in and paint your masks for the density using black and white values for each of these channels, and then channel pack them when you export them out for the different areas of the face. And then you have your overall pore texture, and then you have your pore normal. This just adds micro detail on the surface when you get close. And this can be any map you want to. It does come with a default map, which is this. But once again, you can go to use any map that you want to for that. Everything else here is pretty self-explanatory. You have your hue and desaturation adjustment. You have your tessellation density, height, tessellation density, far. So this will actually be based on camera distance as far as your tessellation density goes. So if you want to smooth out the curvature of the surface and all that stuff, you can. You also have a near and far distance adjustment for how long it takes for that to fade in and out, or where the fade in and fade out zone is, and whether or not that's based on object or world. So if it's set to object, which is the default, it's going to be based on the root position of the object, which is going to be more efficient for characters and things like that you most likely be using skin on. If it's based on surface, then it'll do it based on its distance to the actual polygons, which is better for like landscape actors and stuff like that. Then you have all your subsurface adjustments. So for thin, thick, eyelids, and lips, you have your overall controls for those based on these masks. And then you have your edge roughness adjustment, your overall tiling value for the skin. So if I go and scrub that, I'm just going to scrub your skin. Right now I'm just using a default skin texture. Obviously you can combine all of yours using Substance Painter or something like that to get the best results. Overall specularity values. Your overall rotation for the skin surface. The center of rotation, so this is basically going to make it in the center of the texture or in one of the corners based on what 0 to 1. You can also go in and add a pan value if you want to. I just left this in there because it's kind of a a cool function to have. And if you want to preview, just make sure real time in your viewport is enabled. So if for some reason you wanted to have that, you could. Pour normal intensity, so that's that detail normal. You can adjust the intensity of that. The tiling of that pore value. The overall contrast of the pores. And then the overall flattening of your standard normal. So by default, it's not going to be flattened at all, so it'll look like this. I flattened it down to 0.75 just because it looked a little bit more natural. And you can adjust your overall roughness as I showed you a little earlier. And then you have all your texture maps, as I mentioned earlier. DDX and DDY is actually a carryover because I'm using a material function. It's not really applicable to this material instance. Right, so that's skin, and then once again, it is using a subsurface profile, which you can go and adjust the values for by going into materials, profiles, and then you have a eye inner profile, and then you also have a skin profile. You can go in and tweak those values through those. Okay. The next material I have is a pulse material. So this is basically using a sine wave to pulse values. Now, in this instance, I'm showing a few different values being pulsed. So I'm adjusting the color, the emissive intensity, and also the world position of this asset, all via pulse. I'm also controlling the tessellated displacement offset, as you can see here. But you can go in and change these values to whatever you want. So if you just want like an asset to move up and down, you could disable the emissive values. If you just wanted to pulse colors, you could disable the world position offset. So you can kind of tweak these however you want. So if I go into offset pulse speed here, I can change that. I can also give it an offset minimum maximum value. So right now it's set to maximum value of 50, but I can go to, let's say, 500, and it's obviously going to move farther. Now, keep in mind your position offset should be half. So if you wanted to start at its actual center position and then move up 500 units, you'd want to put 250 as its minimum. So half of whatever value you put in here, just to make sure it's even. So if I set this to, let's say, 250, I'd want this to be 125, right? Or I would set this to 50 and this to 100. So just make sure your minimum value is half of your maximum value. Now this offset distance minimum maximum, this is if you decide to make it a vertex or world position. So by default it's set to world position, which means it's going to offset in X, Y, and Z. If I switch it over, I would actually toggle these offset distance minimum maximum values that are just a one vector rather than or a scalar rather than a vector. So if I set minimum to 0 and maximum to 5, or let's say 50, and then minimum to 2.5 or 25, you'll see it's going to pulse in and out rather than moving up and down, and that's based on this whether or not it's vertex or world. And I actually have to reverse these two. This should say world or vertex because the first one should be if this is unchecked. Right, and then you just uncheck that if you want it to go back to being in world space. And then up here you have the same values but for emissive. So you have an inner and outer color, and then you also have a inner and outer color B. So you have an A and a B inner outer color. So these are Fresnel values, which means they change based on the curvature of the surface. So obviously if this is a cube instead of a sphere, you'll see how it changes. If it's a plane, it's going to be based on your angle to that surface. And whatever asset you have, it's going to be based on curvature. So So in here, you can also adjust those pulse values and then make it, based on, adjust the intensity, the color, all that stuff. So I went in here and adjusted my intensity to maximum 50 instead. It's going to pulse between 0.5 and 50, but it should be, as I mentioned before, half that value, so 25 to 50. Right, and then you can see that'll go pure black and then go back up again. If it's lower than that value, if it's lower than half the value, then it'll basically hold there and then come back up again. I'll set that back to the default. And then you can adjust the pulse speed, as I mentioned before. And just come up with different effects, however you want. Going up here, you have your near and far fade distance. Once again, this is for the tessellated displacement, so it'll adjust the tessellation density based on your distance to the object or the surface in this case. And actually right now it is set to object, so it'll be based on the center of that object. And you can control your near and far tessellation densities and your height and all that stuff. So not only will the tessellation be adjusted based on your distance to the surface, but so will the height. Okay, and this fixes some rendering issues. That's why I have it set to do that based on camera distance. And then down here you have your offset texture. So that's what's offsetting the surface here, but I can switch that to any height map that I want to. It's going to use the red channel of it and just offset the surface based on that. So once again, this is a multi-use material. Some of the best applications I could think of for it are like a flickering or strobing light, or having an icon bounce up and down in the world. And you could even adjust, if you wanted to, the speed of the bounce and the distance of the bounce or the movement based on your distance to that object. And you could have it maybe start bouncing a little bit faster as the player gets close to it, if it's a pickup or something like that. But there's a bunch of stuff you can do with this material. Cool. So the next one I want to show you is a directional blend material. So this is a material that's basically going to render one set of textures on the bottom and one on the top, or it could be whichever direction you want. You can actually adjust the direction over here. But most use cases would be top and bottom. So if you wanted snow to show up on the top of an object and not on the bottom, you could use it for that. So if you had like a roof, for example, in a winter scene, you could have it so it only shows snow on the top, or sandbags, stuff like that. So the values for this are pretty straightforward. So you have a blend, a separate blend mask, which in this case I have here. This basically allows it, instead of just having a harsh cutoff, you can have these little spots around it. And if I adjust the tiling, you can see how that affects it. It's basically just a way to break up the blend there. Overall blend mask power you can adjust as well. As you can see, this surface does have tessellated displacement, so it is offsetting the surface, and you can blend between the upper and lower that way. And you can swap this blend mask out to whatever you want. I just have a default difference clouds in there. I can also do a rotation on that, and you have a bunch of adjustments with it. You can adjust whether or not the tiling is world for the lower and then world for the upper. Everything is separated into an upper and lower level, and then you have some overall blend adjustments here. And then doing blend mask offsets and everything like that. It just allows you to control how your blend mask works. And I can do a blend invert. So if I check this, it's set to 1. If I flip it around, it's going to be set to 0. Right. So you can it's kind of a modifier for tweaking the blend direction. And then you have your upper and lower texture sets, so albedo, normal, and RMAH, roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, and height. Your overall specular adjustment for the lower and upper. Your tiling for your upper and lower individually set here. Rotation upper and lower. You can also do pan speeds for each one, so I can have the bottom one, move like this if I want to, and the top one as well. Everything for each layer you can do for the other as well, so upper and lower. So adjusting the height value for the tessellated displacement, all that stuff is adjustable in here. And once again, this is using camera distance fade, so you can fade out that tessellation based on camera distance, which makes it a lot more efficient, obviously. This surface also supports subsurface scattering. So since this is snow, I have a subsurface scattering value up here. So that's based on your density of your surface, which you can adjust here. And then you can also adjust the subsurface scattering color and things like that. Because I'm doing it on the lower value and it's set to black, it's not doing anything, because obviously the lower one I don't want to have subsurface scattering, but on the top for the snow I do. So I set this to 0 just so it has no density. And then you have your inner and outer color for subsurface scattering color, which I'll show you on the upper layer. You also have your Fresnel for that, which is once again is going to fade around the edges. And then you also have your blend distance upper and lower. So this is basically going to control the threshold for your blend distance for the upper and lower values. And the reason I separate it for upper and lower is just to give you a little more control. Vertex offset lower. So this will actually allow you to offset the vertices of the mesh. Even if you're not using tessellated displacement, you can do that. The reason I have this working this way is if you have an upper layer and a lower layer, and for example, you want the snow to kind of look like it's caked on top of the lower layer, you want to offset those vertices a little bit so it looks more realistic. So if I do that, and let's say I set it back to default, right? It's actually sunk in a little bit. It doesn't look very natural. So I pump out that surface a little bit to, let's say, a value of 7, which is what I had. It looks like the snow is actually layered on top of the bottom layer. Right. And if I go into the subsurface values here, let's say I go behind the light, and then I adjust the subsurface density, you can kind of see how that affects it, right? So if it's set to 0, you see the light coming through the snow. And I think I had it set to something like 0.5. So you can adjust that value as to like how dense your surface is as it's receiving light, right? So for this, I think like a value of 0.2 or so looks pretty good. And then you can also adjust the inner and outer color for that subsurface scattering value. Once again, it's based on Fresnel, just to make it look a little bit more realistic. And again, you have a blend distance, which this would be a negative value from the other one. And this is for the upper value. And then you have your overall surface adjustments here. So this surface blend is basically going to allow this to fade in and out based on its contact with surface. Now this is an opaque material, but it's using pixel depth offset to that. So it's basically a temporal AA dither, which is relatively cheap to render compared to straight up transparency. So if I go into the material itself in the scene, and let's say I drop it down into here. And if you look at the edges of it, you can see that they actually dither and fade out a little bit. Might be a little bit more noticeable out here. Right. So there's actually a slight dither along the edges, and you can control the threshold of that if you want to. It's pretty easy to do that. Right. And you can control the fade distance and all that stuff. So it's very modifiable, and you can get the look that you're going for. And once again, this is not a mass material. It is opaque, so it's very efficient to run, but it does give you a little bit of a blend between the surfaces. And I'll show you a little bit more of that blend in another material we're going to go over in a minute. Right. So once again, this is the directional blend. And as I mentioned before, you can control the blend direction of this surface, so it doesn't just have to be up and down. And you would do that by adjusting your blend distance. So instead of using, RGB become X, Y, and Z. So instead of using the Z axis, I can set that to 0. Let's say I do this here, and I can do the same thing up here in my blend direction for the lower. So instead of this here, I put this here, right? So you can see it's blending sort of in that direction. So you can tweak these values to kind of get what you're going for. Okay. Right, so once again, that's the directional blend material. The next one is an advanced foliage material. So this is a two-sided foliage. Now, keep in mind, in this preview scene, the only way I'm lighting it is actually using a smart image-based light. So it's not going to look quite as, it's not going to pop as much as it will in an actual scene. So like reflectivity values and all that stuff, although they are on here, they're not as noticeable in the showcase scene. So just keep that in mind. When you put them in your actual scene, they should look much better. That's why I'm showing you in the material preview as well. Right. So this is the advanced foliage material. So once again, this is using double-sided foliage, which is designed specifically to make foliage look realistic and efficient. So as you can see here, the reflectivity values are much more natural, and as I move the light around, you can see how all that works. Now, another thing that's cool about the double-sided foliage is obviously it has subsurface scattering, and it will receive back face shadows. So as you can see, if you look at the leaf in the foreground, it's receiving the shadow of the leaf in the background, and it's coming through on this side. So if I go into a flat view, you can see it here. And if I move the light around the back, you can see the light coming through and adjusting it. right? Now the controls for this are pretty straightforward. You have a subsurface density, inner and outer value. So once again, this is based on a Fresnel, so you can see how that affects it there. Once again, inner and outer. You have a Fresnel modifier, so it's basically control the fade distance from the inner and outer edges of the curved surface. You have an overall tiling value, obviously. Usually if you're going to use this for like a leaf atlas or something, you'd probably just want to set that to 1, the default value. I just have it tiled up for preview purposes. Once again, you can go in and rotate it. You can adjust the overall specularity of the surface, which is going to modify the roughness value. You can adjust the rotation center. You can even give it a pan speed if you want to. Once again, this is something that I have in a material function, so I just keep it on all of my assets just to allow you to have more control. It may be something you never use, but at least it's there. It doesn't really add any overhead. But it actually works pretty well for this preview. You can adjust the normal intensity, normal flattening here. Once again, that's something I have on pretty much all my assets. You can adjust the roughness values here. Even though you have a roughness texture obviously controlling it, you can still go in and do some fine tweaks here between each instance. So what might look good on one instance may not look good on another when you switch out the textures. And then you have all your textures here. Once again, albedo and transparency. That's what the T stands for. So it's channel packed, normal, and RMAH. So you basically have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 textures channel packed into 3. This reduces performance overhead, texture size, and also just makes it so you have less assets to deal with. And then you also have a subsurface color texture, which is the color that comes through when the light passes through the surface, the transmission color. Another thing that you can do in this material is I set it up so you can use the albedo as a subsurface. So basically it'll use your albedo color as your subsurface texture, the subsurface color here. And then you can also adjust that texture's hue and stuff like that if you're using the albedo, and it'll only affect the subsurface value. So it gives you a lot of control over it. And you can also just use a solid color for your subsurface, and once again, this will use a Fresnel value, so an inner and outer color value. So it gives you a lot of control, and it's still a lightweight and efficient material. Moving over here, you have a holographic material. So this is a material that's using multiple stage bump offset, basically just to give the illusion of depth. It's really designed to have like a single texture that's repeated over and over in stages, and it looks like it's got some depth to it. Now this is not to be confused with parallax occlusion mapping, which I also have in here, but this will allow you to create some cool like holographic displays and things like that, and they're relatively inexpensive. So if I load this up, I'll just show you some of the parameters for this. As you can see, right, so it's simulating depth. And I'm just using this grid texture with some points that I set up real quick. Now you can see here, it's pretty straightforward. You have a standard texture. Right now I'm just using this placeholder texture, but this could be anything that you want. And then I have an opacity texture that's actually what you're seeing here, this grid shape. Then starting from the top, I have an inner and outer color. So as you can see, as I rotate around it, the color changes slightly. This is based on a Fresnel value, and you can obviously change this to whatever you want to. So if I wanted to make this, more of a red material or something like that, I can go tweak that. A color Fresnel value, this controls, once again, the fade off from the inner and outer colors. And then the overall emissive intensity, how bright that surface is, so you can control that. You also have an opacity threshold adjustment. And an opacity randomization. So this is using a temporal AA dither. So the material itself, all of my default materials I have set to opaque, and then I'm adjusting their blend modes in the material instance just to keep it more efficient. And also when you modify the master material, it's just faster if it's not set to transparent or translucent. Right. And moving down here, you have your more standard features, so you can make it fully metallic if you want to. If it didn't have any emissive value, you'd be able to see that. You can adjust the overall tiling of the albedo texture if you want to. And once again, if you use a different albedo texture, it's going to be more noticeable. You can adjust the rotation, specular, the rotation center, once again, the roughness value. You can even have the surface pan if you want to. And once again, this is going to be your albedo texture that's moving, not the mask. And then here you have depth adjustment. So you have depth A, B, and C. So like the A is going to be the surface itself. And if I use negative values, it's going to push back. Positive values will push forward. You see depth B is a negative value, which means it's moving back. And then you have 3 layers, as I mentioned. So you can kind of make this as depthy as you want to and have different offsets and all that stuff. And then you also have your tiling values for each of those layers. So if I set this one to 2, let's say this one to 3, and this one to 4, right? I can have 3 different layers of tiling if I wanted to. And then if I wanted to, I could use color texture for my albedo. I actually misspoke earlier. This is not my albedo. This is my roughness, metallic, occlusion, and height. But I could actually have a color texture in there rather than using an inner outer Fresnel color. Right. So that is the hologram material. This next one I'm going to go over is an eyeball, so I'll show you here. Now, the texture sets that I'm using are just example texture sets, so you can go in and use your own, or you could use this if you want to. So they have a specific UV set. So this sphere that represents it is actually specifically designed for this eyeball. It's not just a standard unwrapped sphere that I would use for something else. So as you can see, it does have depth to it. And it has multiple layers and all that stuff, but it is a single material. So this is using the clear coat shader. And if we go to the material itself, as I mentioned before, it is designed for a specific UV set, so it's not going to look right on this preview sphere, but I can still show you some of the parameters based on this. Right. So you can see it has depth, all that stuff. So I can go in and control all kinds of stuff. So I can control the clear coat normal, the flattening of that. I can control the normal scale for that clear coat normal. And once again, this is a normal map that's going to affect the clear coat itself. The overall iris depth intensity, I can tweak that value. Iris depth scale. Iris displacement scale. Iris displacement intensity, the overall brightness of the iris, the iris specular value, the iris cloud color. So this is actually the center of the iris. So if you pay attention to it, it's going to change. So I can change that to whatever I want to. The overall roughness of the iris, the iris pupil scale, the refraction of the iris, the overall scale of the iris, the limbus, the index of refraction for the limbus. And if you want to know what all these terms mean, you can obviously look these terms up. They all have to do with different sections of the eye. Limbus intensity, limbus darkness, the width color for the limbus, the width shading, the overall depth of the limbus. I can adjust the overall tiling for my entire eyeball. The brightness of the sclera, specular for the sclera, and then the overall roughness for the sclera. The shadow radius, which is basically going to be an inner and outer fade. The hardness for that shadow, and then the overall shadow color, so I can make that, I can kind of adjust it to whatever I want. And then down here you have all your different texture sets. So you have your albedo for the iris, the albedo for the sclera, the overall normal map, the height map, which controls the depth of this, obviously, the normal for the clear coat, as I mentioned before, and then the normal for the eye bulge itself. And you can choose whether or not to use the eye bulge, which by default it is on. Right. And once again, just keep in mind it is designed for a specific UV set, so you can use this spheres UV as an example, or you can make your own using the texture as a reference. Okay. So the next one I want to go into is a tessellated PBR using pixel depth offset. So this is using tessellated displacement, right? So it does have silhouette and all that good stuff. It is based on camera distance, so you'll see as I pull away, it's going to flatten out. It's not going to be extremely noticeable because it is kind of far away. And then it also has, as I mentioned before, a pixel depth offset. So once again, this allows it to fade in with the surface that it intersects with. So as I pull it down a little bit and I move around it, it's actually got a little bit of a fade between it and the surface below. So it just allows it to blend a little bit better. So you can imagine it being, you know, a rock on a landscape actor or something like that, and it fades in and has a nice little blend. So it looks like it's actually got the surfaces, dirt or snow or whatever it is, blending in with it. But it's a very inexpensive effect, and it just makes it look more realistic rather than having a hard edge between the objects. And this is using pixel depth offset. So once again, this is just a standard opaque material, right? So you can see the blend mode is set to opaque. Now you notice this flickering. That is because he is using temporal AA dither, and it's going to look weird in preview, but in game or in the editor, it's going to look fine. So for this one, I'll just show you in the editor since it does have that weird flickering in the preview. So you have the ability to adjust your overall displacement height. It's based on a height map, obviously. Tessellation density near and far. So once again, if I go into wireframe, you'll be able to see the density. So the near density is when the camera gets close to it. Far density is when the camera is far away. So I have it set to 0 by default, so it will fade out. And as I pull away, you can see how that density lowers. And once again, you can choose object or world position. By default, it's set to object, which means it'll be based on the center of the object, the fade in, fade out camera distance. Or you could set it to the surface, which will be based on basically the polygon's distance to the camera. And then you also have your pixel depth fade distance. So that controls the distance for the fade when the objects intersect with each other. And then the threshold and random and all stuff will adjust that as well. Overall surface tiling, self-explanatory. You can control the scale of your textures. Rotation, specular value, once again, rotation center. You can also add in panning if you want to. And it'll all just work seamlessly. It's very efficient. And a lot of these are using material functions, so they use the same parameters over and over again. Normal flatten, you can go in and flatten the normals if you want to, or if you want to make them more intense, you can use negative values. Roughness adjustment, and then you have your textures, once again, channel packed. You can also use bi-directional displacement. So if you enable this, basically the way it works is instead of just offsetting the surface from your black values to your white values in your texture, it's actually going to take the middle of that black and white value and then push the surface up and down based on that value. So now, as you can see, when I control the height value, it's moving up and down from the center rather than just moving up. Sometimes this can be useful for fixing some rendering glitches. So you can see without it, it's just going to move the surface out rather than in and out. And once again, DDX, DDY is just a carryover from one of the other materials using material function. Before I get to the water, I'm going to save that one for last. I'm going to start at the other end here. So down here, this is a volumetric lighting material. So this is specifically designed to be applied to a particle system, and it will only show or only render inside of a volumetric light. And now the intensity, the color, all that stuff is going to be determined by the light, but then you can also adjust its overall opacity and contribution based on the material itself. So as you can see here, I basically just have a spotlight. It's set to movable. It needs to be set to movable or stationary. Once you bake lighting, if it's set to static, you're not going to see the effects that much. If I move the light around, you can see that it's only rendering inside of where the light is. If I move the particle system itself, once again, you can see it's only rendering where the light is. You can see a little bit on the outsides just because my overall light is actually casting some volumetric lighting, but it's very subtle. So the particle system can be whatever you want it to be. Right now it's just emitting some puffs, as you can see by the outline here. It's just a little cloud of puffs, but you can make it whatever you want to. I'll leave that up to you. I'm not really going to go in depth on that, but I will show you the material setup itself. So with this instance, I can control quite a few things. I can control the overall albedo. This is kind of an overall intensity. I can control the extinction scale, which is another modifier for the intensity. I can control the hardness of the fade. So this is basically a spherical mask that's going to fade off the edges of the particle. I can adjust the movement speed of the particle system inside of it. I can control the overall tiling of the texture mask. I can make this as small or as large as I want to based on what kind of effect I'm going for. And then I can invert that mask if I want to as well. So it's obviously going to recompile shaders very quickly. So basically everything that's in the white value of the mask will render and everything that's outside of it will not. So as you can see now, it has inverted that. So it's basically the whole thing is rendering, but you see a little flicks on the outside. And once again, I can change this texture mask to whatever I want. So if I want to go and grab, let's say, this mask here, and then, bring the tiling down so it's visible. Or if I want to throw in this mask, once again, just adjusting the tiling. Or this mask, whatever it is. In any of these masks, it doesn't matter if it's a tiled difference clouds or whatever it is, it's going to have kind of a soft edge because I'm using that spherical mask on top of it. And once again, this will be controlled, the overall color and everything will be controlled by our light. So if I close out this and adjust the light's color, you can see it's affecting it based on that. And then obviously your overall intensity of the light, your volumetric scattering intensity, all those things are going to adjust how much contribution there is. So you can come up with some really cool effects with this. Some examples would be if you had your particle system just kind of flat and laid out in a large area, you could have mist coming off of a river or coming off of snow or ice, or maybe it's raining out and you want a little bit of mist coming up from the ground or evaporation, whatever it is. Or you just want to like intensify your light shafts coming through a window, or have some low-lying fog that only shows up through the trees. So, you can do some really cool stuff with it. And you can also have multiple layers of these and different multiple instances with different intensity values, albedo and decay values that will, give you different layers of volumetric, and also have different masks and stuff like that. So it's it's a very useful and dynamic material that you can use. So this one is actually a light function. So if you go to your light, pretty much any light actor supports this, and you go into light function, it's essentially a mask material applied to your light. So this can use pretty much any animation or pulse or whatever it is to control the mask of your light. This will not control color or anything like that. It's literally just going to be a mask for where the light comes through. Now, in this, I've got the ability to control the overall intensity, minimum and maximum. So as you can see here, I have a minimum of 1 and a maximum, or a maximum of 1 and a minimum of 0.5. This is basically saying to pulse all the way to dark and then pulse all the way back up to fully bright, right? If I want it to be like 0.75 and 0.1, it's going to just dim a little bit and then come back up. So you can use this for a pulsing light. I can obviously go in and adjust the speed as well. I can control the tiling of the mask pattern. I can choose whether or not to invert the mask. Once again, this will basically just use everything opposite of white rather than white. And I can change the mask itself. So let's say I apply this on there, or I apply difference clouds, or even this, whatever it is. It's sampling the red channel, so it doesn't really matter what kind of a texture you use. And then you also have an overall movement speed adjustment that you can change. And that's it. It's a pretty straightforward material. And once again, the color, everything else is going to be based on the light itself. So the material is not doing any color adjustment or anything like that. It's just, once again, controlling where the light shows through. Now, as of 4.2.5, these material functions don't affect the shape of volumetric shadows. So if you applied this and had volumetric lighting enabled on it, it's not going to shine through in this pattern, the actual volumetric effect. But everything else with it should work as intended. So moving on, this is a parallax occlusion mapped material. So parallax occlusion mapping is basically a stacked shells technique. As you can see here, the surface is actually flat, but it's virtualizing a displacement on that surface. There is no silhouette to it like tessellated displacement. And it's called stacked shells because you can literally see the layers here. So it basically takes a height map and then slices it into however many layers you want, those stacked shells, and then stacks them on top of each other and spreads them out and based on the height map. So that's what's going on here. So this is actually a fairly heavy thing to render normally, but I have a bunch of features in here that make it very efficient and usable. So one of the core features of this is the fact that it is camera distance based. So as I pull farther back here, you can, if you pay attention to the surface, you can see it's flattened out now. As I move in closer, it starts to raise again. So not only is it flattening and raising, but it's actually lowering the shell count based on your camera distance. This makes it extremely efficient because basically every time this repeats, it's rendering the the material, the stacked shells, and all that over and over again. So if you use this on a landscape actor or a wall that's tiled over and over and stuff, it's going to become very heavy. But if you have it based on camera distance, you can really control how heavy it is for performance. So you could actually use this throughout your entire environment and control it based on your camera distance. So right now I have a pretty realistic camera fade. You can't really notice it in a real world setting that it's adjusting its height and its shell count. And the reason I'm adjusting the height as well as the shell count is if you lower the shell count, it's going to be very noticeable at distance. So you want to lower the height and flatten it out as well. Same thing I'm doing with the tessellated displacement for a few different reasons. I've also got a compensation inside the material that helps a little bit with distortion around edges, which is an inherent issue with using parallax occlusion mapping. So I am using a Fresnel gradient around the edges to fade off the shells and the height, so it doesn't look give you this weird warp look that a lot of AAA games that come out now that use parallax occlusion mapping. You see them wrap over edges and stuff like that. You'll see how it warps and distorts and kind of takes you out of the illusion. So I have some things in here to compensate for that. So I've lit up the instance quickly. I'll go in here and show you in the viewport. And I'll just show you on this plane here. All right, so once again, 2D plane, it's completely flat. Once you go around the edge, you don't see the silhouette. You can see the cutoff of it. So a few things I have in here, as I mentioned before, near and far fade distance, whether or not it's set to object or world. Right now, it's by default, it's set to object. Near height, which you can adjust here. Now, obviously, if you push the height too far, it's going to kind of break the illusion based on the amount of shells that you have. And it keeps defaulting to a sphere. There we go. And then you have the overall shell count, so near and far. So as I lower this down, you can really see the effect. So if I drop it like, below 10, and you look at the sides, you can see those shells showing up, right? So the more shells you have, obviously, the better it's going to look, but you don't want to push that too far away from the camera view. So that's why at distance, I have it flatten out and lower the shell count. Overall reference plane, so this basically tells it where to offset from. So if you set it to 0, it's going to offset from the top of your surface down. If you set it to 1, whoops, it's going to, or sorry, if you set it to 0, it's going to be from the top of your surface up. If you set it to 1, it's going to be from the top of your surface down. As I scrub this, you can see that it pushes it farther back, right? So this is basically just telling it where to start offsetting from. Usually a value of 0.5 is going to be good because you'll see the edges kind of lock pretty well. If you set it to a lower value, like 0, right, you can see that if you pay attention to the edges, how it shifts around. And if you set it to a value of 1, it's going to shift around, but from the opposite direction. It looks like it's kind of in a frame. So I usually like to leave it at 0.5 because you'll see it locks pretty well to the edges. Now, if you're tiling this over and over, it's not really going to make much of a difference. And if you're using it for like a brick wall or something like that, I recommend having, at the edges of it, having like a little pillar or something that sticks out and blocks the view from seeing that it shifts around like that, especially, not having silhouette. Overall tiling value, rotation center. You can also pan it if you want to. Once again, almost all my materials have this value just because it's cool to have, even if you may never use it. You can adjust the normal flatten, the roughness value, then you have your texture sets here. And DDX, DDY, that is actually already set up in this by default, so you can just leave that as is. And that DDX, DDY is actually designed for this, for the parallax occlusion map surface. Another thing to keep in mind with parallax occlusion map surfaces is they do not cast and receive shadows based on the height map information. They do get shading from the normal map, which is wrapped around the height map anyway, so it kind of gives a little bit of an illusion of shadows, but there aren't any actual shadows being cast. There is a blueprint method for setting up casting and receiving shadows on a parallax occlusion map surface from the details, but it only works from a single light source, and it's very heavy to use. It's not even really worth setting up, in my opinion. But the surface itself will still cast and receive shadows from other objects. It just won't self shadow from the height displacement from these from the parallax occlusion mapped effect. Now, the reason this is called parallax occlusion mapping and not just bump offset is, as the name implies, it'll actually occlude itself. So you pay attention to this little rock right here, or this one here. As I move around, it's actually occluding the stone behind it. So it looks more realistic than just having a bump offset, which just slides around on top of a height map, basically. And once again, you can change all these textures and all that stuff however you want. Just make sure you keep the same channel packing methods that I have here. Once again, it's roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, and height, and albedo and transparency, and then normal. So next one I want to go to is the same exact material, but this one allows you to do vertex painting. Now, this one only has 2 layers because I am using a height map to blend between the two. So if I go in here, select my modes, mesh paint, and then I select paint, I can go in and actually paint my colors in. So it's basically going to be the presence or absence of red. So if I go in and paint a little bit here, or if I hold shift and paint the opposite color, you can see it goes and paints those values. Right. So it's just a vertex painted parallax occlusion map surface. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this, just due to the inherent nature of parallax occlusion mapping, is these 2 layers, since the normal maps don't match, you're going to see a little shifting between the surfaces, right? But it will blend in better than just using a standard vertex paint material with parallax occlusion mapping, because I am basing it on height. And each one of these layers, just like all of my other materials, each one of these layers can be controlled individually. So each one of these has your ability to control the textures for each layer. And then you can obviously control your A and B values. So A is going to be your layer 1 and B is going to be your layer 2. So you can go in and control the tiling and rotation and all stuff for each one individually. I won't go through all those because it's pretty self-explanatory. Offset height, once again, this just allows you to offset the surface itself if you want to. And if you want to use a shared parallax occlusion mapping height, you can do that as well. And basically just give the entire surface the same height map, which will fix that shifting issue that I told you about, but it won't give you a separate height for each one. So as you can see now, everything is locked together, and it's basically just using the albedo, roughness metallic, and normal, and AO from the other layer, but it's using the height map from the from layer 1. So now if I go in and change the, let's say, tiling value, it's all going to be controlled as 1. So this one is also parallax occlusion mapping, but this one is using a clear coat. So basically you have a parallax occlusion map surface with a clear coat over the top of it, which is pretty cool for a bunch of different kind of effects. And this is the one that you needed that parallax occlusion map secondary normal enabled for, also for the eyeball. So I can go and control the tiling of the lower surface, rotation, center, all that stuff. I can even give it a pan speed as well, so I can have the lower surface kind of panning. So for some reason you want to have, like, I don't know, water under ice or something like that, and you wanted to see depth to it, you could do some cool stuff with this. All right, once again, you have your height controls, your parallax occlusion mapping, you have your near and far fade distance, you have your overall clear coat adjustment here, so you can adjust the roughness for the clear coat separately, you can adjust the overall opacity of it, you can adjust the normal tiling, so I do have a normal over this surface, and once again, it's a separate layer for the clear coat. I can adjust the rotation, rotation center, I can do the normal flattening. I can swap out that normal with whatever I want with the clear coat normal here, and then obviously you have your texture set here for the underlying parallax occlusion map surface. Everything for the parallax occlusion mapping is the same. And then pixel depth offset, if you have this enabled on a parallax occlusion map material, basically the height map from the parallax occlusion map surface will intersect with any geometry, so you can actually make it look like it has silhouette and all that stuff from certain angles. And if you really wanted to pull that off, there's an example in the Unreal Engine content examples, where basically you just have like a slightly curved surface and you can plant it down in the surface of something else, and it'll look like they're little like rocks and stones and all this stuff intersecting with the geometry, even though it's just a parallax occlusion mapped effect. And combining that with the shell fall off based on camera distance that I'm using makes it very performant. The next one is just a standard translucent material. So this is to be used for things like glass and all that. Now this one is more advanced than just using translucency. If you pay attention to the edges here, you'll see the distortion becomes more intense. And also the opacity becomes more opaque around the edges, around the curvature, than in the center. This replicates, looking through glass, and if you look at, like on an angle, it's going to become more dense because you're looking through deeper layers of glass, right? So this kind of mimics that using Fresnel values. So if I go in here and load this up, as you can see here. So we pay attention to the edges of the sphere. You can see that it distorts more intensely than the center, which is more realistic for glass, because once again, you're looking through a denser value of glass. And it also becomes more opaque around the edges. And you can control the inner and outer opacity of these values. You can control the overall Fresnel values as well. So basically how far that fade is from inner and outer surface. Adjust the overall opacity threshold and random. This is actually for the next material I'm going to show you, which is based off the same master. You can control the overall refraction value for the inner and outer. Now by default 1.1 is like no refraction, and anything above or below is full refraction. And you can manually enter in values here if you want to as well. And once again, you can adjust the Fresnel value for like the fall off of how that works. You can make the surface fully metallic if you want to. You can adjust the overall specularity. Usually for glass, I recommend setting it all the way up to 1. Overall roughness of the surface. And it is set up to support screen space reflections and all that. You also have your normal tiling values. I do have a normal on this surface. And you can also adjust the normal flattening and stuff like that. And it'll distort based on that normal value. So you have a lot of control over how the surface works. You can rotate it. You can set the center rotation. You can also give it a pan speed if you want to. This would be great for things like, I don't know, some kind of like very cheap liquid, which I have a better liquid material that you can use as well, but you can still make this pan if you want to. And you also have the ability to add 2 normals in here, so you can have 2 of them going in opposite directions, which I'm using for the normal setup for the water that I'll show you in a minute. And you can pan each one of them individually. And then you have your normal and A and B here that you can use. Right now for this example, I'm just using a single normal map because once again, this is not really designed to be water or anything. It's just supposed to be glass or something like that. And you can also choose whether or not you want a surface fade. So once again, this is that blend between surfaces. So it looks like it's blending in with another surface. For this, I have it disabled just because it's supposed to be glass, but if you wanted to enable it on here, you could. Right, so the next one I want to show you is essentially the same material, but this is actually using a mask with TAA dither. So it's a masked material rather than translucent. So the benefits of this have to do with performance. So actually selected the wrong one. So rendering something as masked rather than translucent is going to be much more performant. It's basically, if you use it as masked, it's essentially the same performance level as using opacity. The reason it's not for that is it's not doing any depth checks because it doesn't need to do any refraction or anything like that. So it'll just render as if it's an opaque material, but it gives you the benefits of having some transparency. So normally, if you use a masked material, it's either going to be completely opaque or completely transparent. There is no in between. But using temporal AA dither, you can see here that I have translucency going on to a certain extent. So there are things that won't work with this. Obviously, it will not refract. The fall off is going to be more noticeable. You see this little pointillized effect. And also when you move around, you get this trailing effect because this is a screen space or a temporal effect, which means it's done over time. So it's not an instant update every time the frame ticks. But for things like VR, mobile, and stuff like that, you can get away with some cool transparency effects using this, and it'll still be very efficient. Even for certain things in a high-end game or a high-end experience, you might want to use this just to keep performance levels efficient. So this has all the same features as the one I just showed you, except once again it does not have refraction. So one more thing that you can use in this, you can't use in the other one, is going to be your opacity threshold and randomization. So the threshold is basically going to control the threshold between your opacity values using the TAA dither. Randomization is going to kind of control how intense those points are and how it randomizes the surface. And once again, this is using all the other same values. So your Fresnel and all that stuff are controlling the opacity. Okay. Oh, and one more thing I forgot to mention on these 2 materials is you can adjust your inner and outer color here if you want to. So you can make your surface look like whatever you want to. All right, so moving on to the water, which I'm sure everybody's been waiting to see. I'm going to start with this one. So all three of these water materials are using the same master material and have the same features, but they are different quality levels, basically. So this one is a completely opaque material that is using pixel depth offset to fade out the surface based on its distance to surface. Once again, using that temporal AA effect. And as I mentioned before, the downside to this is that it will not refract, and it's also got this little bit of a pointillized effect close to the surface. This one is a masked version of that same material. This gives you a little bit more control over the fade and all that stuff, as you can see going on here. And it's also using TAA dither. And then this one is completely transparent, so the highest end, most expensive to render. This one is actually using, the masked version and the translucent version are actually using distance field to get their distance to surface, which is more expensive, but achieves a higher end result. So there are a few things going on with these materials, and I'm actually going to use the opaque version as an example. So I'm going to load this up. And the first thing I want to do is I'm going to disable the pixel depth fade for a second, just to show you some of the features. So one thing you'll notice is that as it gets closer to surfaces, the color is actually changing. So you can choose whatever color that is. Right now, it's adjusted here, and it is using a Fresnel value. So you have your inner and outer color value. You can change here to whatever you want. So this is to simulate, obviously, the water getting shallower and all stuff. So as I lower it down, you'll see the entire surface starts to take on that color. It is based on the distance to surface. Another thing that's happening here is if I disable the color adjustment for a second, and you pay attention to the surface, you'll notice that the normals are actually flattening out the closer it gets to a surface. So it makes your surface look less turbulent, which is more natural. Obviously, the shallower the water it is, the less room there is for the water to move, so it becomes less turbulent. This is also having the same effect on the overall surface displacement. So as I raise this up and down, you can see that the water surface is actually adjusting its overall height value along with those normals. And it just makes the water look more natural in an environment. Now, this one and the masked version are actually pretty efficient to render because there are no real textures controlling anything other than the normals, which is basically just the same normal sampled twice. All the other waves and everything are done via Gerstner. Now moving on to this one, once again, this has the exact same settings as the one I just showed you, but this is a masked material using temporal AA dither. So the fade and all that stuff is going to look a little bit more natural, but still be efficient to render. And then this one is the highest end version, and once again, this is transparent. So this actually has refraction, all that stuff, but has all the same features of the others. Now, because this is transparent and has refraction, another thing that I'm doing is based on its distance to surface, I'm flattening out that refraction value just to make it have a smoother transition. So if you pay attention to the water surface as I move it up and down, you can see how the overall water surface is flattening, the refraction is changing, all that stuff based on its distance to surface. And once again, this is using distance fields to do this. So this gives you a much more natural looking water. So once again, it's flattening out the normals, flattening out the surface, adjusting the color, lowering the refraction value, and all that stuff as it gets closer to a surface. So if I select this flattened out sphere that I have in here, and I move it across the surface, down a little bit, you can see it's actually flattening out the water as you move it around. So another thing that's useful with this material is it's going to make the inside of any object that has a distance field completely translucent, right? So you can see through it, right? As you can see inside here. Now, where this is beneficial is you won't be able to see the water surface inside of objects with distance fields. So what you can do is have basically a no collision material that's set to clear with a clear, a no collision object that has a clear material on it, and you could have it sit inside the hull of a boat or a ship or whatever it is that you want to sit inside the water, but you don't want the water to render inside of it. So this allows you to control basically the rendering of the water inside of objects, which is very useful. And it does it in a very efficient way. Right, so loading up the material instance. You have a near and far color. So once again, you can adjust the near and far color, inner and outer. This is basically near is closer to the surface and far is farther away from the surface, obviously. You have an overall near and far color. So if I go in here and adjust this, or sorry, an overall inner and outer color for your far distance. And that's the distance farthest away from a surface. And you have Fresnel adjustments for those because they are inner and outer values. You have an overall tessellation density for near and far. Once again, that's the tessellation of the surface itself. And this is based on camera distance as well, so it's very efficient to render. You have your overall opacity near and far. So near is set to 0. If I set it to 1, it's basically going to stay completely opaque as it comes in contact with the surface. You also have your opacity inner and outer. So this is the overall opacity for your surface when it's not in contact with another surface. And you have the inner and outer values. Once again, it's going to become more opaque based on your angle to the surface or the curvature of the surface, which is more realistic for translucent surfaces. And once again, you have Fresnel values for that. You have an overall opacity threshold and random, which once again are carryovers from the mass material. It's not going to do anything on the translucent material. And then you have your refraction, inner and outer, which controls that refraction based on your distance to, or your angle to that surface, which once again is more realistic. It's going to have more of a refraction, more of an angle you look at it from, because it's going to have more depth to it. Or sorry, more layers of liquid. Pixel fade, once again, this is a carryover from one of the other materials, or one of the other instances. Subsurface color, this is something you can adjust on all three of these. And you have an inner and outer value that you can adjust. This is going to control the color of the light as it hits the surface and transmits through. And it just makes the water look more realistic. And once again, you have a Fresnel value for that. You can choose whether or not the surface is metallic. If you want to have like a liquid metal effect or something like that, you can. Overall specularity value. Overall roughness. Overall tiling for your normals, A and B, those little micro waves that you see going on, but you can make them larger if you wanted to. Rotation of those normals, you can control those things. And once again, you have an A and a B normal, and basically they're just overlapping over each other. You can rotate them around, you can control their speed and direction. So, you know, controlling how fast the water moves. And you could even make this based on angle and stuff if you wanted to. So maybe moving down, it starts to move faster or something like that if you had like a little lake or a river or something. And once again, you have that for your A and your B normals. Surface fade. So once again, this is based on your distance to surface. And this is used on using the distance fields. So you can control how far away from the surface it starts to fade out. And then also the fade softness, which you can adjust as well. And then you have a separate adjustments for that, for the color. So you can have the color start fading in a little sooner. And you just really fine-tune how your surface looks. And also the softness for that fade. And once again, you have your textures. These are the normal A and B textures you can modify individually. You can choose whether or not the subsurface is a solid color, which it is by default, but you could give it a texture if you wanted to. Whether or not you're going to use surface fade. The overall undulation of the surface. So this controls the large movement of the water. So if I adjust my undulation height near and far, so near is obviously closer to the surface, it's going to flatten out. Far away, like in the middle of the surface, is going to be higher. So I set this to like a 50. Once again, it's the overall undulation of the body of water moving around. You can adjust the scale of that as well. So you'd have a large undulation for an ocean or something like that if you wanted to. You have an undulation speed modifier. And as you can see there, it shows you what it looks like. And then you have all of your wave adjustments. So this is all Gerstner values, right? So your near and far height. So once again, far is going to be away from surfaces, and near is going to be as it interacts with surfaces. So you can really adjust how your Gerstner waves are. So these are all for your large waves, and once again, you have an A and a B for your Gerstner values. And you can adjust the speed for your A and B values. All that good stuff is adjustable in here. And you can adjust your wave scale here if you want to as well. And really just get any kind of look that you want out of the water. You can also adjust your wave direction. Once again for your A and B. And then the overall steepness for each of those waves, which you can see here is just kind of converge the surfaces over each other. And doing those tweak values can just give you any kind of surface that you're going for. Now those are for your large waves. You also have the same settings for your smaller waves. So once again, a Gerstner just on a smaller level, and you can go and adjust those. Your medium waves. Right, so you have your small waves, which are basically just the normal maps that you have. And then you also have your medium waves, which are Gerstner, and then your large waves, which are Gerstner, that are a little obviously set to larger values, and then your overall undulation for your body of water. So modifying these values, you can get some really great results for whatever surface you're trying to achieve for your water. And one more thing to keep in mind is if you want to, you can disable all of the waves, set the tessellation to 0, and just have a flat water surface if you really wanted to. And once again, these are all based on the same master material, and each of these two instances is based on this main instance here. So I can go in and adjust values on this, and it'll propagate to these two instances as well. All right, so that is edition 5 of my advanced material pack for Unreal Engine 4. Hopefully you find it useful. Another thing to keep in mind is I will be adding materials, a few more materials to this that I have planned that I didn't get to make into this pack when I launched it. So there will be probably another 2 or 3 materials added to this over time that you'll just get as an updated version. All right. And check out my other assets on the marketplace as well. I've actually adjusted the prices on all of them because they've been on there for a while, so they're a little less expensive. And this pack I will be launching at a sale price for the first week that it's up there, and hopefully you find it useful.